So I just finished my last ever 24-hour call shift. And for those of you who are not in the medical field, this is something that is very common in residency programs to be doing a 24 to 28-hour call shift where you are working continuously. And most of the time, you don't get any sleep overnight. You just kind of do the whole thing. And so I wanted to reflect on that a little bit. And also, I kind of wanted to see what your guys' opinions on, these 24-hour, 28-hour call shifts is. And I actually had just recorded an entire video on this and then realized I did not hit the record button. So I'm a little, salty about that. But hopefully I can still make a good video for you guys. So yeah, finishing the 24-hour call for me is a little bit bittersweet. I think there's a ton of evidence that they are not good and they lead to more medical errors. Like literally at the end of a 24-hour shift, you really are not thinking that straight anymore. And especially when you have some of the busier nights where I've been on CCU and I've admitted 8 or 9 patients and then had some consults to do at the same time. It is very, very hard to keep track of all the patients at the end of a 24-hour shift. And they all start to really blend together, especially when you're sleep deprived and tired. And I think it really is easy to, make more medical mistakes in those situations. At the same time, there's a part of me that does kind of like the fact that I've, had the opportunity to go through 24-hour shifts. Because I guess part of it is like it's kind of this vestigial part of medical training or historical part of medical training where it's like kind of like a rite of passage for a lot of people. And there almost seems to be a little bit of like a historical significance to it. And then the fact that after you complete it, you can say, hey, I was like able to do this. I was able to like take care of these patients for 24, 28 hours straight, even with little sleep. It almost kind of makes you feel like you have a little bit more confidence in yourself and a little bit more pride too. I think the general trend of most programs is that they are starting to eliminate the 24-hour call shifts. And I definitely think this is a good movement, but obviously this is still going to be around for quite a while, especially like in surgical residencies. You do a 24-hour call every 3 days or every 4 days. As for my last shift ever, I actually was kind of happy with how it went because I didn't want it to be so calm that it was just like boring and a very anticlimactic end to my last ever 24-hour call shift. But I also didn't want it to be like super stressful, like super high strung. And so I think it actually ended up being like a happy medium. We ended up admitting 4 patients overnight and 1 ICU patient. And then also had one guy who was kind of sick. So we placed a central line and 2 A lines. And so overall it was a very busy night and I didn't get any sleep that night. The previous night, 4 days ago, I was able to get like 3.5 hours of sleep, which was pretty nice. So I did some reading, just a brief Google search about the elimination of 24-hour resident call. And there's a couple of good articles here. Is the elimination of 24-hour resident call a good idea? And I like how there's just like a yes right here. But basically, they talk about how reviewing the evidence, they found that residents make 36% more serious medical mistakes, and they are nearly 6 times more likely to make serious diagnostic errors, and they are 2.3 times more likely to be involved in a car accident after a 24-hour institutional on-call. So the next section, they address the handovers or handoffs, and this is something that a lot of proponents of the 24-hour call talk about, is that it reduces the number of handoffs between different teams. And, every time you're handing off or signing out to another team, there's more opportunities for miscommunications or things to be missed. However, this article says that it would be a mistake to think that handoff errors did not occur with the 24-hour institutional on-call system. I mean, think about it. You're still handing off at the end of the day after your 24-hour shift, and you're probably going to forget things because it's at the end of 24 hours. They wrote that some care models optimize patient care. They provide for a consistent day team without the awful day after syndrome, and an overnight team that gets to know the patients. I actually really like this, the idea of splitting it into a day team and a night float team, because when I'm on a night float team, you're there on nights for the entire week. And I actually do feel like you start to get to know the patients over time. Whereas when you're doing the 24-hour call shift, you're doing your regular day shifts, and then every 4 days you do 24 hours, and you only get to see those patients that are not on your team every 4 days. So in that sense, you don't really get to know the other patients on other teams as well as, the night float team would be able to. I guess the downside with the night float team is that you're going to be working a lot more nights. So you're going to have to be kind of like on a nocturnal schedule. In conclusion, they write that today's residents are tomorrow's supervisors. Their training must prepare them for medical practice. There is no evidence to support the argument that residents must perform 24-hour institutional on-call shifts in order to fulfill their role as supervisors. In fact, there is evidence that working 24 hours in a row has harmful effects. This has already been demonstrated. The next article I read, and this was a really nice op-ed that was written in 2020, and it's talking about the flawed logic of residents' 24-hour work shifts. And it starts off by saying, I had been awake for nearly 24 hours working in the ICU. Earlier that night, one of my patients died unexpectedly. Breaking the news to his family was still a fresh wound. Later, amidst the exhaustion and frenetic pace of my work, I made an error by ordering a patient a medication she wasn't meant to receive. By hour 22, I still had 5 admission notes to write. Critical patient information was stored in my head and needed to be entered into the EMR. The next thing they start to bring up is this case back in the 80s, a very famous case that a lot of people cite and are aware about because it actually led to a lot of changes in the residency programs. But there was this Libby Zion case, which was this young girl who was the daughter of like a prominent journalist who attributed her death in part to the fact that she was cared for by sleep-deprived, inexperienced resident physicians working 36 hours with inadequate supervision. And a few years later, this actually ended up leading to a lot of changes in the residency training models, where we had a new instituted 80-hour work week limit, whereas in the past there basically was no limit. And at that time, 30-hour shifts were still permitted. The medical establishment maintained that 30-hour shifts are good for patients because they reduce handoffs between residents and are good for residents because they provide the opportunity to observe patients' clinical course and the effects of treatment strategy over a sustained period. However, multiple studies have shown that the rate of medical errors increases with 24-hour shifts. Residents working prolonged shifts are more likely to sustain needle stick injuries and be involved in motor vehicle accidents. And this is definitely an issue because I've heard of it multiple times, people falling asleep at the wheel after their 28-hour shift. In 2008, the Institute of Medicine recommended that if 30-hour shifts are to continue, residents need to be guaranteed 5 hours of sleep. However, that guaranteed rest time has not been effectively put into practice. With good luck, I have occasionally gotten 5 hours of sleep, but I've also had entirely sleepless nights. And this kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier, where, you know, on a good night, I'd get like 3 hours of sleep. But on other nights, like yesterday, I basically got no sleep. In 2011, the ACGME mandated that shifts of first-year residents, known as interns, be limited to 16 hours. Second-year residents and beyond were permitted to provide continuous clinical care for 24 hours with an up to additional 4 hours for handoffs to other team members after that. And then they start talking about some of these studies where they compared interns working 16-hour shifts versus 30-hour shifts, and they measured 30-day patient mortality and hospital readmission rates, very, very important outcomes that we often look at in research studies. And they found that there was no difference between programs with shifts up to 30 hours versus shorter 16-hour shifts. And so instead of, you know, claiming that, okay, this 30-hour shifts doesn't seem to lead to improved patient outcomes, they instead turned around and said that in researchers' talking points, this claims that longer shifts don't negatively impact patient outcomes in general. So this is like one of those things where you could totally like skew the interpretation of the study based on what point you're trying to prove. Like, I think the onus of the researchers in this study was probably that they should have needed to prove that 30-hour shifts did improve patient outcomes, and then you could justify some of the known, you know, side effects or downsides of doing the 30-hour shifts. But instead, they just said, oh, it's no different. So this means 30-hour shifts is good, which I think really didn't ultimately prove anything. So then this person wrote, however, the outcomes measured in the trial don't capture the day-to-day experiences of interns' clinical care. They don't tell us if the more sleep-deprived interns made more medication errors, or if they took longer to recognize clinical changes in their patients, or if they are less attentive to patient experiences like pain control. The study did, however, find one significant difference between the two groups with different hours: the interns' own experiences. Interns with longer shifts reported a negative impact on their morale, health, and overall well-being, as well as on educational experiences like pursuing research and teaching medical students. With longer hours, interns were roughly twice as likely to feel that their fatigue negatively affected their personal safety and their patient's safety. Remarkably, despite these concerning reports from the interns themselves, the study results were actually used to justify the longer hours and reverse a prior cap of 16 hours for interns. Meanwhile, 80% of respondents in a public survey reported that they would want a different doctor if they found out that their doctor had been awake for over 24 hours. So anyways, there are a ton of different articles, and I have to admit that I haven't truly delved deep into the research on this. But overall, it does seem like the trend is to go away from 24-hour shifts. And I'm curious to hear about your thoughts on this, because I think there are still a lot of people who do think there's some value in the 24-hour shifts. And even for me, I felt like it was a valuable experience to have gone through that. And if they do disappear completely, I feel like I will have a sense of a little bit of sadness that we aren't doing it anymore. But, if we're truly being evidence-based, which is what we pride ourselves on in medicine all the time, is to, look at the research and tell us, is this actually a good standard of practice, or should we be doing something else? And the person in the op-ed actually, talked about this as well. And if the evidence is telling us that 24-hour shifts are not good, then really we should be taking them away. But again, do you think the pros of the 24-hour shifts, such as reduced handoffs, and kind of building that confidence for residents and kind of letting them see a patient's whole course over 24 hours is worth it? Or instead, do you think we should be implementing more of the day team and night float structure in order to minimize medical errors and reduce the rates of fatigue and depression and burnout, which are kind of the main side effects of doing the 24-hour shifts? Anyways, curious to hear what your thoughts are down in the comments below. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you in the next video, and peace.